Welcome back to The Heat. The United Nations envoy for Syria traveled to Moscow on Tuesday in an effort to extend a cessation in hostilities to the northern Syrian city of Aleppo. Government airstrikes and rebel shelling have killed hundreds of civilians in the past week, and on Tuesday another hospital was destroyed in a rocket attack. Joining us now from Damascus is Mohamad Ali. He's a Syria-based journalist who's covered the war and politics in the region since 2005. Also with us from Los Angeles is Majid Rafizadeh. He's a political scientist and the president of the International American Council on the Middle East. Thanks to both of you for joining us. Let's go to Damascus first, and Mohamad Ali. As I just said, another hospital in Aleppo hit, several people killed, lots more injured. Has the ceasefire, or cessation of hostilities as it's being called, completely broken down?
Well, not officially, but according to developments on the ground, over 7 days of intensive shelling by militants inside Aleppo of government-held areas. This is definitely signaling that this cessation of hostilities deal in Aleppo in particular has collapsed eventually. Now, today there was a huge escalation of violence. Militants have organized a very huge attack, offensive on Syrian government and army positions, particularly in the western part of Aleppo. According to the General Command of the Syrian Army and Armed Forces statement just today, it said that the Al-Nusra Front, along with Jaish al-Islam, Ahrar al-Sham, and other smaller terrorist groups, have joined forces and attacked the Syrian army posts west of Aleppo. This is definitely signaling that this cessation of hostilities deal for sure collapsed in Aleppo, and we are hearing about talks happening right now on the international level to perhaps restore calm to the city, implement a kind of a regime of calm or cessation of violence or a ceasefire, whatever you name it. The aim which Russia and the United States are working for seems to be how to restore calm to Aleppo due to the violence taking place. And regarding the hospital you mentioned, yes, it is named Al-Bayt Hospital. It is in a government-held residential area called Al-Muhafaza. 17 people were killed and dozens were injured as a result of a terrorist rocket attack on it.
Right, Majid, as Mohamad has been telling us, these high-level meetings have been taking place in Moscow right now. The UN Special Envoy is there, is having talks with the Russian Foreign Minister. The Special Envoy is also talking about a transitional government and elections. Is this going to happen? Are you optimistic that this will happen, given the level of violence that's still taking place in that part of the country?
That's a good question, Donnie. You know, they've been discussing this transitional government for several years, and I don't think it's realistic because I think the political gap between pro-Assad group and the anti-Assad groups it's very deep to bridge. Pro-Assad allies is still like Iran and to some extent Russia. They're still not ready to see Assad step aside and create a new democratic government based on democratic elections. And I think that on the other side, the U.S. and Western allies and other Arab countries in the Gulf, they demand that Assad steps aside before any kind of transitional government occurs. So I think, as you see, like the political gap, I think between two sides is too deep. So it's less likely that we will see any kind of legitimate transitional government which will satisfy everyone on the table.
So if, as you say, that political gap is too wide, Majid, what's next? What happens? Does this war just continue?
Yeah, well, it's unfortunately, yes. I think this is. I think this is. I make an analogy between the Syrian civil war to some extent, like the Lebanese one, which went for many years. You might see some short-term ceasefire held because it's beneficial for both the rebel groups or Assad group. They want to reorganize. They want to requip. But then these ceasefires are not going to be sustainable. They're going to break out. So more like likely because of the complexity of the war in Syria, the conflict, which is it's not only one war. You have several wars occurring at the same time. You have the regional Cold War, you have the international stalemate, you have different countries sponsoring and funding and arming different groups inside the country. So what you have in Syria is largest regional and international proxy battleground in the world. So it's this kind of proxy battleground, when it becomes regional and global, it's less likely to be resolved anytime soon.
Majid, part of this agreement talks about a transitional government, talks about new elections, as I mentioned. Is the Syrian government, President Bashar al-Assad in particular, going to agree to this?
Well, his action shows no. He already held, before the peace negotiation talks, there were parliamentary elections, and he wanted to project the picture that he is a legitimate president and the parliament is a legitimate representative of the Syrian people. So, okay. And if you listen, I mean, to his speeches, he definitely believes that he is the legitimate leader of Syria. So I don't think you're going to see fundamental changes in the political structure.
Let me get Mohammed's view on this. Mohammed, is the Syrian government going to agree to that? New elections, a transitional government?
Well, if we look back to what President Bashar al-Assad said in his latest interview with a Russian media outlet, he was asked about the Syrian understanding of the meaning of a transitional process. Now, the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad pointed out that a transitional political process for the Syrian government only means a new constitution and also new elections inside the country if the Syrians agree to, which means in the end that the Syrian government is definitely not going to discuss handing over power to any kind of Syrian opposition group, whether in Geneva or in any other place. The Syrian government believes that only elections inside the country, with the Syrians themselves deciding who their president is, how their constitution should be, and all other political issues. So definitely, I don't see that Geneva talks will be having any successful results in the end, because the so-called HNC, the Higher Negotiations Committee out of Riyadh, coming out of Riyadh, this committee believes that it is going to Geneva to take power, to take the authority, to take the presidential seat in Syria, while the Syrian government says that it will not and never discuss such an issue in Geneva. Only perhaps a new government could be formed, which would include opposition figures for sure. However, the president's seat and also the constitution is something that the Syrians themselves inside the country should be deciding.
So the President Bashar al-Assad himself has ruled out any likelihood that he's going to step down, as some parties to this agreement are calling for.
Well, the Syrian president said it, and he was very clear that only the Syrians should be electing and choosing who the president is. Not Saudi Arabia, not Russia, not the United States, not any other country or group. It is only it is an exclusive right for the Syrian people here across the country. So definitely, the president. I mean, the entire war in Syria, the entire fight is for the independence of the Syrians' decisions. It's for the sovereignty and unity of Syria for sure. Now, after 5 years of steadfastness by the Syrian army, by Syrian armed groups on the ground, by the Syrian leadership, by the government, definitely after 5 years, and they are still standing on their feet here, the Syrian army, they will definitely not hand over power, and they will continue defending the independence of the Syrians' decision and the independence of Syria's decision in the end.
Okay, Majid, while all of this is going on, of course, a humanitarian catastrophe is unfolding in Syria right now. Yet there doesn't seem to be any sense of urgency on the part of some of the major powers in the world to get this resolved, to ease the suffering of the people in Syria. The United States says that it's sending in an additional 250 troops. That's 250. Is that going to do it? Is that going to solve anything on the ground?
No, definitely, it's not going to solve anything on the ground. And I think the more one country is increase its military assistance to some groups inside Syria, then other sides also will do the same, and then you have more militarization and radicalization of the conflict. Unfortunately, I think when different governments look at the Syrian conflict, they look at it from more military perspective, and they think that the resolution is going to be more involving different kind of financing and arming and training different groups, and I think that's the predominant perspective now, how they look at the Syrian conflict. I mean, there are still some organizations that they are doing humanitarian aid. We shouldn't ignore them. They're helping Syrian people, but I think when you have such a crisis in such a, I think, a big extent, I think it's very difficult to reach everyone inside Syria. And again, when there is a conflict inside a country, usually regional countries or global power look at it from more political, opportunistic prism. They will start to direct the conflict in a way that they will preserve their own geopolitical interests, and I think this is done by every country. There is I think there is no exception here. So they will try to direct it in a way that it can preserve their geopolitical interests. But when we have different groups, opposite groups in this conflict, then that, I think, going to increase the severity and the longevity of the conflict. And I have to add just one comment about what your guest said about the Syrian people. I would like to ask him who does he mean by Syrian people? Because when I talk to people, I mean, there are different areas inside Syria that are controlled by different groups. It's hard really to let I think Syrian people to choose who they want. I think there are some areas which are controlled by Assad, and those areas still. People live in fear, so it's really hard to say we should let the Syrian people decide.
Okay. Mohammed, Majid has a point there. It'll be very difficult to get an accurate reflection of Syrian opinion, of the Syrian choice, because large parts of the country are not under the control of the government right now, are they?
Well, I definitely agree that you cannot get all of the Syrians, 100% of the Syrians' opinion if you make elections. But let's take into consideration that there are large parts that are controlled by the Syrian government. Homs entirely controlled, except for about 3% of it. Al-Wa'ar. You have Damascus and its countryside. Many of those are controlled by the Syrian government. Tartus, Latakia, Dar'a, Al-Suwayda, all of those areas are controlled by the Syrian government. So we cannot say that the larger parts are controlled by opposition groups. This is the first point. The second point, the Syrian government believes that terrorism will not stop it from carrying out political process across the country. For example, there was parliamentary elections across the country recently. For sure, this is according to the constitution. It should be made. And definitely the Syrian government's message was that terrorism across the country will not stop Syria from undertaking such measures and procedures, political efforts, all kinds of efforts that could perhaps make a suitable ground for any kind of peace talks or a peaceful solution for the Syrian unrest. So yes, the Syrians can choose, they can decide, but definitely not all Syrians can, because of the presence of terrorism. And let me also add just one point, which is that most of the civilians who are being able to get out of opposition-controlled areas are rushing to the government-held parts of the country, and the government is actually giving them temporary shelter and all of their basic needs. This is according to what I have been covering on the ground and of what I have been seeing. I went to eastern Al-Ghouta, where the civilians were actually running away from the militant-held areas due to the looting happening over there and due to the suffering inside those areas.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Mohamad Ali, Majid, Rafizadeh, thanks to both of you for joining us.